Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston.
We're your hosts and real-life sisters who binge on historical drama.
We'll talk about films, fictional adaptations, and dramatic series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
So fill your teacup or mug with your favorite sip as we explore what's fact, what's fiction, and the so what on historical drama with the Boston Sisters. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical films and dramatic series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. Listen to past episodes and sign up for our newsletter on our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters to stay up to date on new episodes and bonus content. In this episode, we talk about the 18th century composer Joseph Bologne, Chevalier de Saint-George, whose life story is the inspiration for the film Chevalier, featuring Kelvin Harrison Junior in the title role. Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-George, was born in Guadeloupe, the son of a wealthy white plantation owner and an enslaved African woman. In the film Chevalier, Joseph's father brings his son to France to enroll him in an elite boarding school. After some initial resistance by the school's headmaster, Joseph's father tells his son to play the violin, demonstrating Joseph's exceptional talent, which more than qualifies him to be admitted to the school. Chevalier highlights Joseph Bologne's improbable rise in French society as a celebrated violinist-composer, horseman, and fencer. Saint-George is bestowed the title of Chevalier by the French royal court and is a favorite of Marie Antoinette. Word spreads about Saint-George throughout France and beyond. John Adams, the future second president of the United States, described Saint-George as, quote, the most accomplished man in Europe in riding, shooting, fencing, dancing, and music, end quote.
As in real life, Chevalier de Saint-George becomes involved with many Paris society women and has an ill-fated love affair with a talented singer, Marie Josephine, played by Samara Weaving. His mother Nanon, portrayed by Roenke Adecowejo, arrives in Paris, reminding her son about the capriciousness of his lifestyle and associations, especially with regard to his racial identity. A falling out with Marie Antoinette and her court puts Saint-George's social status and musical career in a precarious situation. He must find a new path for himself and music at a critical time that will ultimately determine France's social and political future. Joining us for this conversation about Chevalier is Julian Ledford, Assistant Professor of French and French Studies at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. Professor Ledford specializes in early modern French and Francophone literature, with a particular focus on Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-George, and 18th century women writers' contributions to discussions on masculinities. Professor Ledford's additional research interests include ethnic, racial, and sexual alterity in the early 18th century, French Baroque opera, and second language teaching and learning. Professor Ledford's article, Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-George and the Problem with Black Mozart, appeared in the Journal of Black Studies in 2019. Welcome, Julian, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah,
we're delighted.
We've been planning this conversation for months since we learned about the film Chevalier, which had its big premiere at TIFF, or Toronto International Film Festival, in September 2022. So I know it's for many people an introduction to Chevalier
Yes.
de Saint-George.
Hmm.
Tell us, how did you learn about the Chevalier de Saint-George, and what made you want to do your scholarly work around him?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I'm embarrassed to say that I only learned about Saint George, maybe 5 years ago. I grew up listening to classical music. I, played piano all my life. I was actually, it was my entire thing growing up. My identity was built around piano performance and classical music. And, I studied it in high school, went to college, grad school. Even today, I pride myself on being able to answer all the questions on Jeopardy that have to do with classical music. But for some reason, and this is the embarrassing part, I had never ever, you know, um, discovered Saint George. I never heard about him, wasn't taught about him at all in any one of those spaces growing up. And so, I was mostly interested in language theories, early modern language theories, and the development of French opera in the 17th century. And, doing studies around that and just, maybe some preliminary research, I looked into French composers, right? And just on a whim, French composers of color. And there, in plain sight, pretty much online, was a reference to Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-George. And at first I thought, no, clearly this must be an oversight. I would have known about this person, clearly, but I didn't. And just this, as I keep saying, embarrassment. I was like, how could I, the person who, thought so highly of himself and his knowledge about classical music, how did I not know about this man? And so I had many, many, many questions. I started doing, trying to answer these questions. And it's true that the more I keep looking for the answers, there are more questions that are coming in, which is a good place to be in for, a researcher. It means that there's work to be done in the field. It means that there needs to be more people studying this man's life. And so I am just, completely fascinated by him, by his entourage, the people he considered to be his friends, the different pockets of information that we have popping up in different parts of, the archives, in newspaper clippings, in, private correspondence, by singers and actors, that's what's passionate for me now, and that's what's really fueling this work. And I think my students as well find it interesting, if not a little maybe daunting at times, because there's so many questions we have, and a lot of his life is obscured. It's I say obscured from view. Not that we should maybe back away from studying his life because we can't find the answers, but it should force us to look even more closely and to think differently. So it's even from beyond the grave, you could say, he's inspiring us to work differently. So that's my little interest I have now in Saint George.
Yeah. I can remember many years before the film, the Washington Post published an article. It was sort of like, wow, about him, and made the connection between violinist, composer, and musketeer. So they were kind of connecting him with the Dumas
Right. Legacy.
story.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about that later. But what are your thoughts in terms of why was his story lost to history for so long? I mean, you've been studying French literature, French history,
Yeah.
Music history, yes.
music
Exactly.
history.
Exactly. It's you know that's a very, very good question. It's true that in the early 19th century with Napoleon and with the restoration of the French monarchy, there was this attempt to ban his music, an attempt to reduce his presence in the archives. But it's true that history just wasn't kind to Saint George. He didn't have the privilege that other composers had, and we can unpack the word privilege in different ways. He didn't have a sort of, assigned documenter, an assigned historian, an assigned cataloger, someone to actually, preserve his music and to catalog it in a certain way that, would allow future musicians and future performers to easily access the work. And also, we have to mention his race, of course. And the movie does show this accurately, that, there are different people in power, actors, singers, benefactors, who did not want to see a person of color become the director of the French opera. And I do believe, had he become the director of the Paris Opera, this idea of obscurity would not be an issue. He would have been given more resources. He would have been, given more status and power to have his work published easily and preserved as well. So we can never forget that he was a person of color trying to excel in an art form and in a society that was pretty hostile. In 1777, we have one of the Police des Noirs, where there was a deliberate attempt to reduce the presence of and the mobility and the movement and the freedoms and the privileges of Black people within France. And in 1777, that's when he wrote his first opera, Ernestine, the one that we heard in the film. So just thinking about, a person of color, a Black man, trying to navigate those spaces when there are laws being written that tell you have to go register yourself at the, at the certain registers to make sure that we know where you are. Maybe certain people are told not to come into France. So many obstacles were put up in his way. And I believe those contribute today to why we have lost a lot of his music, and a lot of it was just not preserved.
Joseph, your essay, which I'm hoping that our podcast listeners are going to read, which is called Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-George, and the Problem with Black Mozart. That reminded me of when I was in middle school, and again, talking about history that was not accessible until certain crisis events made people understand that maybe we should, and particularly being in a primarily Black middle school or junior high school. My world history teacher brought into the classroom a book called The Introduction to African Civilization. And one of the study questions was around a leader in the Songhai Empire who was Askia Muhammad I. And the question was, why should Askia Muhammad I, how is he like the George Washington of Songhai? And I remember raising my hand in class and saying, why are we asking why Askia Muhammad is the George Washington of Songhai? Why aren't we asking why George Washington is the Askia Muhammad of the United States? Because, of course, these empires, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, existed prior to the United States.
Right.
So why is it important not to refer to Saint-George as a Black Mozart?
Right. I love that story, and I'm happy that you raised your hand to ask the question, because I feel as if we're getting at the same thing. This tension that arises for me, and clearly for you as well, is the fact that in the term Black Mozart, we do not at all say the name Saint-George. We completely erase, his name. Even if you want to say Joseph Bologne, but in no way in that equation do we hear the name Saint-George. So we've erased him from the equation. The second problem is the equation itself. How did we arrive at the term Black Mozart? And without any sort of context, we are left to understand that there's Mozart, and we understand who this person is. We pay homage to him, we pay reverence to him, we worship him almost, and then we say, just so you know, next to him or someone, there's a Black version of Mozart. And so we have, a sort of warped understanding of who Saint-George was, and I do understand that this was not, how Saint-George was referred to in the 18th century. This is something I do believe that was created in the 21st century, to sort of help or to maybe fuel Saint-George's, how should I say, his rediscovery, if you want to say that. I don't say discovery because it makes it seem as if he was completely lost. Yeah, but the idea of that persons who loved Mozart, who loved his music, who revered Mozart, would then also perhaps spend some time thinking about this other person, the Black Mozart, right? But the second or the third thing that's kind of confusing and is misleading is that it completely reduces Saint George's legacy, and it's misleading. It's fraudulent almost, Black Mozart, because it makes us believe that Mozart started his career and was so influential that another person who was not expected to be great or expected to be excelling in the same field as Mozart managed to do so, right? Which is not the case at all. So this idea of Mozart being the prime or the one to create the art form and to excel in it, and then you have the imitator coming after, which is Saint George, is not true. In fact, Saint George was already well established as Europe's greatest fencer, and as a leading violinist in France. Right when Mozart was just trying to establish his career, Mozart's dad told him, "Hey, when you go to Paris, try to get commissions from these orchestras, right? Because you're trying to build your career. This is something you have to do as a young musician, right?" So Saint George was completely established and on his way to glory. Before Mozart came around. But going back to this issue of privilege, right?
Yes.
Mozart had the privilege. He had a father figure, a steady father figure, someone who invested a lot of time and energy, and money, of course, and resources in his, career. Saint George, his father was very influential in his life. This is true, but he wasn't a permanent presence, and because of that, we have to think about, the notion of privilege. Who was able to, have a career that was maybe more well established, or one that was maybe longer lasting, especially for today. We have things that were preserved pretty well. With Mozart, yes, and so his legacy, I guess, would in the 21st century be greater than Saint George's for those reasons. But the term Black Mozart doesn't help us understand anything about Saint George's life, and for those reasons, I found it problematic. And not just me, but many scholars have always been concerned about just the use of that term and the continued use of it and the popularity of the term, right? And how misleading it is. Once again, there was no context given to us, just Black Mozart, right? And left to our own devices, we're going to say, okay, here's this Black man making his way in a white world, and he kind of made it, and he's a Black Mozart. So that was very, very problematic for me. Yeah.
The other part of that is that assuming that all classical music is the same, because
I know. Yes.
We know Germany was different from France, different
right,
from England,
from Austria, yes,
Austria, etc.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the fact that Saint George also brought innovations to music.
Exactly.
Yeah. Who would have been some of his other peers, musical peers, and other maybe even Black creatives and aristocrats? We have had a conversation with Gloria Samjali, who's a British artist who collects images of Black aristocrats, and she's had some commentary around Chevalier as well. But
it's great.
And you mentioned that the interest in that world as you became more familiar with Saint George. So who would have been some other contemporaries part of his circle in France at that time?
Yeah, so it's interesting because even though he was in France, his influence, was pretty universal, pretty global, I would say. So we have to, of course, mention Mozart as one of his contemporaries, even though Mozart was younger. But we have to mention Haydn as well and Gluck. In the film, we do see this sort of rivalry between these composers, which is highly fictionalized, I would say, but not out of the realm of possibility. I mean, they knew about each other clearly, and they were leading composers in their own right in their different countries. Within France, though, there are other many composers. Gossec, for example, is one that we have to mention, who had a hand in guiding Saint-Georges and maybe helping him to craft his musical genius, I would say. Another Italian composer, maybe naturalized as well, composer was Lully, who is someone who's always mentioned when it comes to Saint-Georges, because Saint-Georges wrote music for different performers. Stamets is someone else that comes to mind. So there are quite a few French composers in the same circle, I would say, as Saint-Georges, even though Saint-Georges's his work was not so much to imitate or to just maybe recreate the same structures that were given to him, but to use the structures, master them, and then warp them into something, or maybe elevate them, I would say, make them into something that was really particularly his own. And so a lot of the poems and odes that we see written to him, praise him for that, for finding his own unique style in everything he did, not just music, but in fencing, in different forms of maybe sports, athleticism. He found his own style, right? And so it's one thing to understand his contemporaries, but then to understand that he was in a lane of his own. He, which takes a lot of, I don't know, it's very bold to do that, right?
Yes, courage.
Right, courage, exactly. And then to, within that, master the taste of the French, because he's praised as well for being, the child of taste and talent. So it's one thing to have the talent, but then to sort of, tailor your talent to meet the taste of, an entire French public is, it's unfathomable what he did, right? So once again, not that I'm not interested in comparing Saint-Georges to his contemporaries. I think that could be useful and very meaningful work. But I am most interested in just looking at the ways in which she was completely unique, which will have to include some comparisons. But I think we need to spend a lot of time as researchers, as scholars, just really absorbing his music, his notes, his writing, and then from there, just maybe once we fully understand his genius, then we move on to maybe finding out, well, what were his contemporaries doing, and where could this have been? What it maybe when it comes to inspiration, how would this have inspired other people, other composers, in different countries, maybe within France? How can this be considered to be French style? What about this is so unique about French taste? Why was this acceptable? Why was this loved by the French people? Right. That's where I am mostly.
Well, we raised the question because, for instance, when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance, I mean, very distinct voices of many kinds, and yet a coterie of people who were, not working together, but often inspiring each other and exchanging ideas and being very excited about what they were trying to do at the time. Yeah.
Yes, and that's interesting that you mentioned that. I do believe, at the time for Saint-Georges, she was a part of, different circles, different salons with different women, of course, but also, he was on the court. Marie Antoinette was one of his, benefactors, you could say. The fact that he wrote his first opera, called Ernestine, based on a popular novel, kind of, for me, it shows the connections he had in different parts of French society. He was also, a Mason, so he was in a different, in a lodge, a Masonic lodge.
Yeah.
So, a lot of exchanges would have happened in those spaces, and it could have been there that he sort of ascertained, what would be considered acceptable when it comes to French taste. And when we say taste, we can't forget the idea of, investment, the idea of making sure that people would come back over and over and over to hear your music and pay to hear your music, that different, publishers would be willing to, publish the music. Different libraries would be willing to rent the music and sell the music. So, he was also a good businessman, I say. I think. He had different investors willing to put up their reputation, their money to support him, right? And that beyond just those artists who were composing music, but even those who had nothing to do with music, nothing, people who probably didn't even care much about, his music, understood that this is someone that we should invest in because, it seems to have this magnetism around him. People want to come to him. People want to hear his music. People want to talk about him. Even if there are rumors, people want to have his, his name and his music, around them. And so that's also something that's very fascinating to me. How attractive he was to so many different people.
Yes, yeah.
Imagine what he would have done with the internet.
Exactly.
For sure.
Exactly.
Let's talk about that style of Saint-George. When someone's listening, what should they listen for that would say, that's Saint-George. That's his style.
Right. Yeah. So unfortunately, I'm not, a string player, but I appreciate from those who do play the violin, for example, that Saint-George demands, something different, something additional. Yeah, when performing his music, like literally, you have to find different ways of moving your fingers on the fingerboard.
I do play violin, or I did.
You do? Wow.
Now you scare me when you say that.
But that's the thing. There's this intimidation factor that comes in when it comes to performing his music, because you're doing things that are not traditional, things that you would probably not have been accustomed to doing. That physically there's more demanded of you, and it's more virtuosic, for example, and in different ways as well. But also his treatment of strings in general is something that I think and I've heard is completely remarkable. Something that really marks his music, his treatment of symphonic music, but specifically the music written for strings. But also he created or he pioneered the symphonie concertante. So this musical form where you have maybe dueling soloists playing against the orchestra.
Wow.
And many scholars have said, looking at, for example, two violin soloists on stage, you can almost see this creation of a battle, a sort of like fencing battle between these two people, even though they're using bows and not, swords.
Yeah.
And so this energy that's coming from the music, this, and it's not violent music, because we think of maybe, fencing as I don't know, a sort of battle, but just more energy and this
it's like a violin
innovation.
dance off, right?
Exactly, right. And I do like
They used to call it Battle of the Bands.
there you go. There you go. This battle that you see on stage, and I do understand from many orchestras that they love to stage that music and perform that music and program it because it's really passionate. It resounds, it resonates well with the audiences, who can sit and they can see this energy coming from stage, and there's the best response to that music is just to applaud, because the energy is fed into the concert hall, it's absorbed by the people watching it, and they have to just, respond with just, this guttural clapping and shouting. So it's very inspiring music.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Visit our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters. Share this podcast. Join our historical drama community by signing up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future episodes and bonus content.
Now, back to our podcast conversation. So there's a scene in Chevalier which I see as like kind of a cultural moment where he's been rejected, he's despondent, and his mother, Nanon, takes him to the neighborhood where other people of African descent are drumming and dancing. It's almost like a street festival. And Saint-George joins the drumming circle. And you kind of see him like be revived by being in that cultural setting. What were your impressions of this scene, and how much might it have reflected what it was like for persons of African descent living and working in France at that time?
Yeah, I do remember that scene pretty clearly. And to be honest, at first, how should I say this? At first, I was a little concerned because it was, for me, something I didn't expect to see. It was, highly fictionalized, I would say,
Yes.
which is fine. I feel as if it was still very entertaining, though, and I think that's one of the goals of this film is to really entertain the viewer, right? Using Saint George's story as as the main idea, the main theme. So that's great. But thinking about it now, in light of your question, I'm looking at the use of the instrument, the drum, which is a sort of like double or counter to the violin. So the violin is seen as this European instrument that's the center of symphonic music in Europe. And when I say Europe, we could probably almost say white. It's considered to be, something that is not traditionally associated with the Black experience. And then we see Saint George leaving that scene, going with his mom to a different, even though fictionalized space in Paris, where there's a drum circle, as you're saying. And he sits at the drum and he touches the drum and he plays the drum and he sorts of, melds, fuses himself with that group, with that experience. And we see the drum as the heartbeat. The drum as the heartbeat of maybe I don't know, West Africa or different parts of his clearly spaces that he would have been drawn from, and his mom especially being an enslaved African. So I do love that. The presence of the drum there for me was very, very special. Very it's culturally, I think, and I think the director should be applauded for that, for taking that that freedom to include the drum. Now, the other part of your question has to do with the privileges, I guess, or the mobility of persons of color in France, and highly problematic. The Black presence in France. Even Saint George, when he came to France, he should have been there for 3 years. He should have gotten an education, learned a trade, and then he would have gone back to the plantation, right, in Guadeloupe. But for various reasons, that wasn't the case. He stayed in France, and eventually he was manumitted, and he was a free person of color living in France, thanks to his dad's influence mostly. But other people, who were enslaved Africans who were brought to France, they would not be allowed to move as freely. They would have to be linked to their enslaver, you could say, and then after their time was up in France, they would go back, right? But with the different police des noirs, the different laws written to limit and to reduce the movement of persons of color in France, that space, the entire, especially within the cities, became very hostile for persons of color. Saint George, because of his status, as I said, if he was Europe's greatest fencer, he was called the French Hercules. He was called the Apollo of harmony. He was set apart. He was, distinguished in such a way that he was able to move more freely in France. And it's true that some of these police des noirs didn't really work. They weren't really practical, because at the time, and still today, clearly, there's this idea of understanding what type of person of color you were. Meaning, well, are both of your parents enslaved Africans? Are you of mixed race, mixed heritage? Maybe a grandparent was an enslaved person. Where did you grow up? So different questions asked about your political status. But clearly for Saint-Georges, because of his talent, because of his particular story, he was able to, in some ways, and I'm going to be very careful with how I say this, in some ways he was able to transcend racism that would maybe render his life or render his experience completely, how should I say, flat, or take away all of his power, all of his privilege. Racism wasn't able to completely destroy him. I would say, and that goes back to something I should have mentioned before. When it comes to Black excellence, I do see in Saint-Georges this idea of a person who, knew that he had to be better than his peers, and then on top of that, had to find a way to navigate, a hostile and racist society and still be able to survive. And I think today his legacy should be that. For classical musicians today, Black classical musicians, that unfortunately, they still have to be better than their peers. They still have to, not just have their notes, as Leontine Price would say, but have to, be so well prepared and so versatile and so resilient that, their resilience and talent and the energy that they put into their craft will surpass, racist attempts.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I do think that idea of Saint-Georges being able to still survive and still be relevant today is a testament to that. This Black excellence, this idea of him, not allowing the hostile society in Paris and France, to completely render his life useless.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Well, one of his someone who shared a similar experience, of course, was Alexander Dumas.
Yes.
Who wrote The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo, and his father, General Thomas Alexander Dumas, who almost shares a similar origin story. My question is, in talking about that similarity in origin stories, Alexander Dumas' father, Thomas Alexander Dumas, joined the military. His father brought him to France. His father was an aristocrat. But when his son expressed an interest in joining the military, his father protested and said, "You cannot use the family name," which was Davy.
Mm-hmm.
And he used his mother's name, his enslaved African mother's name, Dumas. And she didn't come to France at all. She was sold by the father. That's a messy, messy, messy story.
Yeah.
For another time, another podcast. But it seems that the military was a way to prove yourself and move up in society. And both Thomas Alexander Dumas and Saint-Georges took that path. Given that Saint-Georges was the great musician and composer, why would it be necessary for him to join the military?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and honestly, something I'm still thinking about now. It's true though that before becoming a great musician, he was a great fencer, and so he was also part of the king's entourage as a sort of bodyguard for the king, and so the sense of duty when it comes to protecting the crown, protecting the nation, it doesn't seem strange to me that he had that, that desire, or that, that instinct already in him. But then to join the army, to fight in the Revolutionary Wars is interesting. But not so much that he joined the army, but that he sort of maybe abandoned his music. And
Mm.
that's what I'm concerned about. I'm wondering if Saint-Georges, at a certain time during the Revolution, it was made clear to him that his music and his benefactors were all considered to be the enemy of France now.
Ah,
Well,
If
that'll
Marie
do
yeah,
it.
Antoinette, there
yeah,
you go.
yeah, yeah.
And this is just a theory that I have that he wanted to distance himself from those persons who would be considered, problematic. Those people who are going to be guillotined, and wanted to prove more so that he was on the right side of the war.
Mm.
So I'm a true patriot because I'm fighting for, France at the border, right? I'm fighting in Lille, in the north of France. I am, protecting the kingdom from, the country, I would say, from different, let's say, monarchs or monarchies that would want to hinder the progress of the patriots. So there I am not surprised that he would want to defend or to take up arms or bear arms, because that was his first instinct, I think. But it's more so the idea that he didn't continue writing music. He didn't continue composing. Now, it's not surprising that someone who was in music, moved to a different career. I think different men did that. That's the idea of understanding maybe the masculine education, or the way men were educated, or the lifestyle or the lifespan of a man at that time could involve different careers, moving from writing to composing to opera to the military. So that's not too strange for me, but it's just the fact that his music seems to have just kind of died off
Yeah,
towards the end of his life. That's more so concerning.
Well,
yeah.
what was so interesting to me was that he mentored Thomas Alexander Dumas, who would become a great general until he was betrayed by Napoleon. But as I said, that's for another podcast.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right, right.
Well, Julian, you mentioned earlier that Saint George did not have those documenting his music, those
Right,
preserving it, and Napoleon actively tried to erase him.
right, right, right.
So, but we have some surviving compositions. How,
Mhm.
what happened? How were we able to save some of that music from obscurity?
Do you know? I think it goes back to this idea of black excellence. This idea that um, his light was so great. His reputation was so huge that it would take. I mean, it would be impossible, really impossible, to completely eradicate him or to completely remove him from our consciousness. Um, you know, if people were speaking about him in different parts of Europe, they were printing even cartoons or different, caricatures of him in London. If different newspaper articles are coming out about his music, if different, economists or investors are saying, well, this is the person for the job because, he is, French Hercules, he is, the Apollo of talent and taste, or, if everyone is speaking about you, right? And in different formats as well, different locations, different venues, different countries, then at that point your fame is so great that it would take an act of God almost to completely eradicate you. And so I think the fact that we have anything remaining of Saint George just reveals to us how huge he was, how great he was, how um, unforgettable, how well established as an 18th century figure he was. Hmm.
Genius. Yeah. Now, you took your students to see the film. What were their impressions of Chevalier and their
Yes, I did.
reactions?
I did. My first time actually taking students to a film. I think in general they were, happy to be a part of this revival of Saint George's music and his, you know, his influence. They know that there are many, many questions that are left unanswered. But just to be able to speak about Saint George to their friends, their parents, their other professors, and to see that at this moment in history, everyone is investing in different aspects of Saint George's life. They really appreciated that on a global level. It's true though that they probably read too much, meaning they're able to say, "Huh, I don't think that's actually accurate," because I mean that was in 1777 and this is now 1789, so there's a 20-year difference almost. So so they're hypercritical of the different things,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which is great. It means that they did the work.
Yes.
They did
Absolutely.
the
Yeah. Yeah. That's our hope, is that people will see a film or series and then go find the real
Yes,
history.
yes,
Yeah.
Yeah.
exactly. I also think they and other critics have said this. The focus on the love affair or the love, yeah, between Saint George and Josephine was probably too central, I think, for my students. They probably would have wanted some more about his rise to fame as a fencer, maybe
I
more
did.
about, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
So, but here we go, though. I mean, we want this one film to be everything,
Right.
but
Yeah.
it can't be.
Yeah.
We're so happy that it was actually created, and I think my students as well, and me as well. I feel as if I am. I appreciate the work that was put into this. I appreciate the actors. I appreciate the costumes, the music, everything. It adds so much to Saint George's story already. The layers that we don't have in a silent archive. We see a letter. We read about a story. We read about the Paris Opera and that fiasco with those three actors, but to have it put on screen and put into a different context with the lights and the music and the emotion and the acting, it's really, really helpful to help us understand the gravity of how of how tremendous this actually was, and how tremendous this figure was, for him to be in the same circles as the most powerful people in France at the time. It's something that we sort of overlook, maybe, if we read too quickly. If we sit in a silent archive over the silent book just on our own, reading in our heads, we don't seem to fully grasp the how great, truly great, this person was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the purpose of films, that even if they don't follow the chronology as we know it, they create the environment and the atmosphere so that
Yes,
people can
exactly.
see and imagine. So when they go back to the material, even listening to the music, um,
Yeah.
Yes,
that they can visualize it
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
easily.
exactly,
Brings it to
Yeah.
exactly.
life.
Well, speaking of going back to the music, is there a favorite Saint George composition you would bring to a listening party?
Do you know? I think people who watch the film will probably be tired of this already, but that aria from Ernestine, the one that we heard over and over and over in the film, that's the one I'm actually studying right now. It's one of my projects now, just trying to understand, what happened with that first performance, because we do know that opera only had one performance and it was pulled. It was considered a failure, actually, not because of the music. Everyone is quick to say it's not because of the music, but because of the libretto, the poetry, the words. So we have this idea that the words that were written by I'm forgetting his name. It'll come back to me. Laclos, who wrote the words. That's where maybe the opera fell apart, but the music was good. But I want to understand more about why the opera was written. I do like this idea, something I thought about myself, that the opera could have been written as a sort of maybe first performance for Saint George, at the Paris Opera. Like, he expected to become the director, and this would have been the first opera, that he would have put up as a director, perhaps, but it'd be good to have other people listen to this music, and to just maybe pull out different things that they understand, things that they hear, things that they are questioning, just to have more people interested to find out, well, huh, why was this opera written, and what's the true story about why it failed? And
Yeah.
so this I guess maybe it'd be not a listening party for the general public. There are people who are maybe musicologists, those who study maybe the Italian comedy, who study opera, 18th century opera, to find out, could this music have been written for the French opera? And was it repurposed for something else once Saint George found out, well, hey, I'm not going to become the director because of these three actors who complained to the Queen. Right?
Yeah. Opportunity missed.
Uh-huh.
Well, Julian, having seen the film, and you've done so much research, and this has been a really great conversation.
Yeah, rich conversation.
Yeah. What do you anticipate will be the ultimate impact of the film Chevalier at this time?
Yeah. I think we're seeing it right now. This podcast. I mean, I thank you so much for putting in the work to actually prepare this conversation and to promote this film. I think this the true, I guess, benefit of the film is that it will inspire other people like yourselves to invest more time and energy in correcting Saint George's legacy. Maybe putting more energy into programming his music and learning more about what he might have written. I like at the end that of the film, it is that there's no denying that this person existed. That's not a question. This is not a fictionalized character. Maybe certain things, the timeline maybe is changed. Some things are played up. Some things are maybe added to maybe help the story, help the narrative. But there's no doubt in our minds that this man existed. There's no doubt in our mind that he experienced, different forms of racism. There's no doubt in our mind that, he was one of the greatest fencers and musicians in his time. And so that alone, those fundamental facts about Saint George, are going to be published widely. And I think that's a lot to ask for. And I think as we continue maybe having the film, I think the film will be released on streaming services in a month or so.
Yes.
I think.
Yes, soon.
So
This
more,
month.
yeah. So
June.
more people will be watching, and we will have persons who will have critics, of course, who will have constructive things to say. Yes, maybe some things that are negative, some things that are positive, but in this case, having more people just write about this man, is already enough, right? And so I think this is the first of many, I do think, films that we'll have. We'll have more documentaries, more biopics, maybe.
Maybe a dramatic series.
Perhaps.
We've now come to our lightning round. Taquina and I come up with questions that relate to the themes of this podcast.
Yeah.
And we ask all our guests to participate by answering these questions. So I'm going to kick it off with the first one.
Sure.
If you could go back in time, Julian, where would you go and why?
Okay. I think this one is pretty straightforward, pretty obvious. I have so many questions about Saint George's life that I would want to go back to the 18th century, specifically between 1745 and like 1799, right? And I would observe Saint George. I would perhaps become, I don't know, a musicologist, documenter, like publisher, right? And I would, make sure I would, he would be my main client, and then I'd sort of also be a historian, or novelist, or I'll take copious notes.
Yes.
Right. I'd observe this man's life. Maybe become obsessed, you know, just to make sure that I had more written down, and something that maybe a future historian could publish, or maybe have a good foundational book about St. George's life.
Yes, yes. So we regard ourselves as also being people who are living history.
Mhm.
So if you were to put 3 items into a time capsule that reflect your life and the times you've lived through, Julian, what would those 3 items be?
It's a interesting question. I think I'd put a Jamaican flag. I am Jamaican, and you know, a lot of my identity, yeah, revolves around all aspects of that culture. I mean, sure, Jamaica has many issues, many problems, but that was the site of my introduction to classical music. It was the site of my development as a musician as well, playing in different settings, especially at the church. With my parents as well, who were the sources of my inspiration, my family. So definitely, I would put a Jamaican flag. I would also maybe include a music note, or some I don't know, a brooch or something that had a music note on it, because that's a part of my identity too. Just this appreciation of music, of all types of music,
Mhm.
honestly. But it's true that I do appreciate opera a lot. I love that expression. I love that we go out of our way to say to say something in a different way, to you know to sing it, and to sing it in different ways, and to be very extra about it.
Yes, yes.
That appeals to me a lot. And then something else, maybe something that represents a journey, like a compass or something, because I've just, in my own life, I've been um, concerned too much with the end goal, honestly.
Mhm.
Like, arriving somewhere and saying I've done it, cross off my list and move on. And then I don't spend enough time appreciating the journey,
Yeah.
Yeah.
what I'm learning every day, every step of the way. And then, of course, if you don't, if you arrive at, where you think you're going and it's not what you expect it to be, then you think the entire journey is a failure. Right. So something that represents, the act of traveling, the act of appreciating the journey as opposed to the destination. Yeah.
Yes, yes. That's beautiful.
Julian,
Yeah,
we definitely have appreciated this journey through the life of Chevalier, or Joseph
yeah.
Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-George, and the film Chevalier.
Yeah,
So
you
thank you.
really brought him to life for us. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I really appreciated this, and I enjoyed talking to both of you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Searchlight Pictures Chevalier is available for streaming starting June 16, 2023. Search online for streaming services. Fees may apply. Chevalier is directed by Stephen Williams. The screenplay is written by Stephanie Robinson.
We invite you to share this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters with someone you know who would enjoy the conversation. Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters and enjoy past episodes wherever you listen to your favorite podcast.
Visit our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters for more information and resources related to this and other podcast episodes.
Sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future episodes and bonus content. You can write us at podcast@michonnebostongroup.com. Like and share Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your social media.
This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast about historical films and series dramas. Visit our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters.
Tell us what historical dramas you're watching. Who knows? We may do a show about it. Sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the podcast, and share it with the people you know who binge on historical drama.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michonne Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michonne Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston. Thank you for listening.